So, Frank, if you don't mind, I was going to ask you the first question before I open up to the audience, because in the week of the results of the Comprehensive Spending Review, I can't resist but to think about the quote there by Humphrey Davy and think actually of how that type of statement appeared quite frequently in the run-up to the Comprehensive Spending Review by scientists claiming the importance of science. So I just kind of wondered, is there anyone today that is sort of campaigning with this sort of rhetoric that reminds you of Davy?
Fortunately not. I mean, I think this sort of rhetoric is seriously misleading because it presupposes a linear model, that a piece of scientific research, piece of scientific knowledge, piece of methodology created in the controlled environments of the laboratory and the study can get out there and suddenly do stuff effectively. Davy was incredibly lucky with this lamp. The thing about methane is that it has a very high flash point. When it goes, it really does go, which is why it's so lethal. But to get it to go is actually quite hard because the temperature of the flash point is so high. Had it been much lower, had it been significantly lower, this wouldn't have worked. And one can do this. Andy could have still got some gas, not quite, and still shown that it simply wouldn't work. So it works with methane. And that misled Davy and a lot of other people into believing that you could do a piece of scientific work in the laboratory and take it into the outside world. Davy later became a serious cropper in the 1820s when he tried to electrochemically protect the copper bottoms of Royal Navy vessels, and that resulted in the entire Royal Navy being disabled in 1825.
So not so important to the state then?
Not so important to the state, yeah.
You were talking about flashpoints and the size of the... Is it the size of the gauze that, like the holes in the gauze, is it proportional to the flashpoint of the whatever's being burned towards whether it's smaller or larger, if it can protect against this gas?
Well, one of the things about the controversy between Stephenson and Davy is that, as you saw on the slides of Stephenson's lamp, the hole size doesn't actually make a huge amount of difference. A flame won't pass through those holes either. Hence the title of a paper I wrote some years ago on this called "How Big is a Hole?" I mean, it's not obvious what sort of size, what's the optimal size of the hole is. I mean, it may well, in modern chemical analysis, have some way of analysing those kind of proportions, but I don't know the details of that. But the point is, it's spreading the heat. You've got the flame in the container, and the object of the exercise is to spread the heat around the metal, whether it's sort of Gauls or Stephenson's lamps, and reduce the temperature below the flash point that methane goes. That's the key thing, is the heat distribution over an area rather than the hole size itself.
Anyone else? Okay, gentleman just up on the stairs. Please, Jane, behind you.
Thank you, fantastic talk. Just a couple of observations. It's interesting that Davy was independent means and able to read and study.
Sorry?
Davy was of independent means, the same as Darwin and Newton, so he's able to study at leisure. The other observation I'd like to make is that the biggest empire the world has ever seen was founded on coal, and also trains to take the soldiers, whatever, out to the world. So there you have two giants of that particular era, that began the empire.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I've commented elsewhere, that Britain is an island of coal surrounded by water. I mean, and those geofacts are sort of really quite critical to the sort of development of this country. So yes, I agree entirely.
So, Frank, while we're waiting for another question, I'll ask another one. Well, actually, it's not a question. It's just I wondered if you might like to say a little bit about your team's work on the audiences of Davy, because I just thought, you've got to gather in front of an audience here. They might like to know a little bit about Davy's audience.
Right. I've got a number of research students who, by pure coincidence, I certainly didn't plan it this way, are working on aspects of the history of science communication in this building over the past 2 centuries or so. So Rupert Cole over there is working on George Porter and the sort of cultural arguments of science in the 1950s and 60s, and is finding some really fascinating material on Porter. So, for example, Porter gave an answer to C.P. Snow's question about scientific literacy on sort of knowing laws of thermodynamics by presenting a 10-part television series called Laws of Disorder on thermodynamics. Can you imagine the modern BBC, how many channels it's got, doing a 10-part television series on thermodynamics now? So really seems rather improbable. Another student is working, Hattie Lloyd, is working on Humphrey Davy's audiences, and particularly the number of women in the audience. And so she's demolishing quite a few well-worn stories about Davy. So, for example, one thing that you will see if you just go onto any website about Davy is that Davy attracted large numbers of women to his audiences because he was good-looking. Now, he may have attracted Jane Priest, but that's certainly not the case. One of the things that did attract women to Davy's lectures was the patriotic rhetoric, such as lobbing lumps of sodium and potassium at French ships, because there's a lot of work being done recently on the role of women on the home front, so to speak, in the war against Napoleonic France. And that's really a very important story that she's telling, understanding the sort of social context in which you communicate science to an audience. And a student I'm supervising at the University of St Andrews is working on the publications of the Royal Institution in the first 30 or so years of its existence, and comparing them with similar journals in the German-speaking states. So the RI always tried 3 times in that period to produce a journal to communicate science, and most of them failed. 2 of them failed within about 2 years. One of them did last for about 20 years and then failed, and it's not until the Proceedings of the Royal Institution was founded in the 1850s that you get a journal that lasts for 150 years, until that failed in about 2000.
Any more questions? Yes, on the back row.
Hi, yeah, I found it interesting you talking about the row between Stevenson and Davy. And it struck me that it's quite similar to the row between scientists and engineers today. I've seen a lot of fights in pubs over this. So I wonder, was that common at the time, that sort of different ideas between science and engineering? Because my impression of sort of historically is it's sort of all wedged in together.
Well, it's certainly washed in altogether in the end, but the path was extremely rocky. Since Francis Bacon at the end of the 16th century, there's always been a strand in English thought that knowledge itself is power. That if you know something about the natural world, if you know something about the laws of nature, then you can control nature. The problem with that is that doesn't really start happening until the 19th century. You can you can imagine the entirety of industrialization in the 18th century, the steam engine, the potteries, mass production, all that sort of stuff happening without anybody knowing that gravity obeyed an inverse square law, or that light was made of 7 colours, if you believe light's made of 7 colours, but only Newton seems to have believed that. And so what you get is a sort of retrospective rewriting of the historical record, that because you have something called the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries, and you have something called the industrial revolution in the 18th century, both of which concepts most historians, I think, are problematic, to put it at its politest. Therefore, because A comes before B, A causes B. And the trouble is the amount of evidence that science had any role in industrialization is actually very remote indeed. Possibly in ceramics, possibly on a good day, if I'm feeling in a good mood with Wedgwood, possibly yes. But it's really not until the 19th century when you start getting scientific understanding of electrical phenomena in particular and some chemical phenomena that scientific knowledge really starts generating practical technologies. And even then, it's very, very difficult. My personal view, looking at things like electricity and molecular biology, for example, it takes about 50 years from the fundamental work to have been done, and computing is another good example, until it's actually put into mass production on something that will work, that you turn on a computer and it will work. You don't have to sort of kick it. I mean, when I was a student, I had access to an Elliott 803 computer. It put me off computing for 10 years. It was such a useless machine. So, yes, science now does have a profound impact on engineering, but it does take a long time because it's all very well to have a discovery, but there's a lot going on, because when you take something in from the laboratory into the outside world, there are all sorts of other things. Just look at the Davy lamp. You've got sort of things like media interest, business interests, religious interests, which I didn't talk about here, all sorts of other interests, all playing a role in developing the application of that knowledge. It's not easy, and one of my jobs is to sort of unpick that, which is what I'm doing on Davy, and it's great fun, I have to say.
Okay, yes.
First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture.
Sorry, come on.
Just on,
hello.
just
Oh, sorry, yeah, okay, yes, sorry.
Davy has always been one of my heroes, not least because he made some comment to the effect that you can always tell the quality of a man by how well his wife looks. But I wondered, is it correct that Davy actually stopped being director of the RI in 1812, and that he then developed the Davy lamp after that, when he was a gentleman of wealth, married to a rich wife?
Yeah.
And also, can you say something about his presidency of the Royal Society?
Yes. He wasn't director of the Royal Institution. That post was not created until 1965 explicitly for Lawrence Bragg, on which see a paper by Rupert on that. And yes, he did marry extremely well, and so he could resign being professor here, though he kept the job of director of the laboratory until 1825. And he resigned as Civil Board of Agriculture and Secretaryship of the Royal Society of London, which was then a paid position, because, as I said, he married a woman with £60,000 of capital and £4,000 a year income, and could buy a rather nice house in Grosvenor Street, just round the corner. And he said, I'm going to spend all the rest of my time doing research, which is what I want to do. Which is actually doing justice is probably what his intention was. And indeed, in the first few years after his retirement at the age of 34, he was actually quite productive. He produced his elements of agricultural chemistry. He produced his elements of chemical philosophy, both very, very important books, certainly agricultural chemistry went into many, many editions. But thereafter, his sort of productive work tends to decline. The lamp's one example. He gets heavily involved in the Herculaneum papyri project at the personal command of the Prince Regent to go to Herculaneum to try and unroll these papyri, nearly 2,000 years old, that have been buried by the eruption of Vesuvius and destruction of Herculaneum. Not quite sure what happened there yet. He wasn't formally expelled from Naples, but he came pretty close to being expelled from Naples. He certainly left very rapidly, one has to say. He gets involved in the electrochemical protection of ships' bottoms, which I said, which I mentioned earlier. So it's not a hugely impressive record of work, considering the amount of time he had available. What he does is that he pursues a social career, rising to succeed Banks as president of the Royal Society of London in 1820. Now, the problem with that is that Banks had run that society for 42 years, and the Royal Society was, indeed still is, a faction-ridden organisation, and the job of the president is to keep those factions from tearing each other to pieces too much. It's a highly political post. Banks had 42 years of practice of doing that and had done it extremely well. If you like nepotism and all that sort of thing, he'd done it very well on his own terms. First-rate job. Davy, with his romantic sensibility, believed that simply by sheer force of personality, he could come in and replace Banks, and he couldn't make it. And there's lots and lots of mistakes and errors that he makes that he just hadn't anticipated. So just to talk about one, that's his treatment of Faraday. Faraday, in 1821, had discovered electromagnetic rotations, the principle behind the electric motor. Davy, from the presidential chair of the Royal Society of London, accused Faraday of plagiarising his friend William Hyde Wollaston, who happened to be one of his fishing mates. And as Faraday wrote, he was never in the same relationship with Davy afterwards, which is not too surprising, one has to say. Now, the problem then is that some friends of Faraday nominate him to be elected a fellow. Davy has to oppose him. Now, he opposes him partially because he sort of sees Faraday as some sort of rival, but politically, he's got to oppose Faraday because if he doesn't come out explicitly against Faraday, everyone would assume he was for Faraday, as Faraday was seen as Davy's protege. And we'd be back to the good old Banksian days of nepotism. So Davy opposes Faraday. So it's that sort of problem that Davy's never able, throughout his sort of 6 or 7 years as president, able to overcome. And the last straw, so far as the Admiralty is concerned, who's a major player in the society, is the disaster with the Royal Navy over the electrochemical protection of ships' bottoms, because they cannot believe that their entire fleet has been disabled by Davy, and they put him under enormous pressure. He suffers a stroke, resigns early from the presidency and goes abroad and dies in Geneva in 1829. So it's all those sorts of issues. I mean, I could go on at great length about Davy and the society, but I shall control myself.
There's a final question just from this gentleman here. If you just wait for the microphone to come to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Davy was notorious for his gas parties. What do you think he was trying to achieve during that time? Was he just having a good time, or did he have another motive?
Well, partially it's entertainment. I mean, that sort of Gilray cartoon. If you just read through people's diaries, there are quite a lot of these kind of laughing gas parties recorded. Not all public, one has to say. A lot held in private houses and so on. And one has to assume that there's a lot that goes on that aren't reported in people's diaries and letters. So partially it's having a good time, but partially it is polite entertainment, I think is the phrase they would have used at the time. So it's something that's perfectly respectable to do.
You don't think it was anything to do with developing anaesthetics?
No. I mean, Davy sort of observed the anaesthetic properties of nitrous oxide, but didn't do anything with it. It wasn't what he was interested in. It didn't even occur to him that it would have an anaesthetic property. And you don't get anaesthesia being used like that until the 1850s. I mean, it's surprisingly late.
So I noticed in your choice of demos tonight, Frank, you decided not to do the laughing gas.
I think our health and safety officer might have had one or two words to say about
Yeah, I
that.
think it would have been altogether different discourse tonight. So I think we've run out of time now. So I just wanted to ask all of you if you wouldn't mind joining me in thanking Frank for a wonderful discussion.